Liberation Wellness for Life.
Live from Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty, it's the Liberation Wellness Hour with your host, author and wellness expert, Kevin Brown. Liberation Wellness presents accurate health information and is restoring America's heritage of health one person at a time.
Well, hello and welcome to the Liberation Wellness Hour. Your host, Kevin Brown, coming to you from the cradle of liberty, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And very thankful we are to be joining with you today, and thank you for taking the time. Do want to mention, our flagship book, since we're talking about books again today, is The Liberation Diet. It's been around now for a couple of years, and it is really becoming mainstream. When I first wrote the book, we were considered a very cutting-edge kind of material. But nowadays, people are calling me and say, everybody's saying these very same things that you were saying a few years ago. So I was a little early to the dance about healthy eating and lifestyles. But it is available on our website, liberationwellness.com, or on our store, Liberation Wellness Store. Please patronize us if you can. We do appreciate it. We don't make much money in the business of promoting real food and promoting those things that are good. So we appreciate that you go out of your way to patronize us. And anyway, so today we have a very special guest. We had her on our show a few years ago when she wrote, she's a best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author of the book called Addiction. Years ago, we had an interview with her. Her name is Pam Killeen, and she is from Canada. And Pam is joining us today because she has a new book out. It's called Survival of the Unfittest. And it's an excellent book, really about sexuality, a subject that some people just are a little uncomfortable talking about. Pam is not uncomfortable talking about these things, which is wonderful. So we're going to try to see if we can bring her in on Skype. And Pam, can you hear us? And welcome to the Liberation Wellness Hour.
Oh, yes, I can, Kevin. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And, you were on the cutting edge of understanding the importance of animal fat and dietary cholesterol many years ago when you wrote your book. And the low-fat, basically you were exposing the low-fat lie when you wrote that book. And you were a pioneer when you published it. And like you said, more and more people are starting to understand how we've been duped in the area of, scaring us off these very important nutrients, animal fat, cholesterol, the fat-soluble vitamins that are included in the animal fat. And we see the fallout in terms of our physical health, our mental health, and our sexual health. I think for the most part, people who understand how reducing animal fat and cholesterol in our diet has compromised us physically. I think when I wrote my addiction book, it was about how it compromised our mental health. And I thought it was important to also explain how a low-fat diet has destroyed us essentially sexually as well. And as you mentioned, it's the elephant in the room. It's a taboo subject. People are very, very uncomfortable talking about it. But you're very familiar with the work of Dr. Weston A. Price. And when he studied primitive cultures and analyzed their diets, and he noticed that, where the cultures had maintained their traditional foods, including lots of animal fat in the diet, that fertility was optimized, that they really didn't have a problem with fertility, childbirth. Children were not fussy. They were in a good mood, from birth. And he just would compare these primitive cultures to cultures where they had distanced themselves from the traditional foods, from the traditional diet, including the animal fat. And that's when he would start to see all sorts of health problems in these cultures. And so today, if you transpose what he learned through his travels studying primitive cultures, and you look at what's going on today around us, Kevin, I mean, it's absolutely shocking to see the rates of infertility, erectile dysfunction, low libido, miscarriages, stillborns, birth defects. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And I'm very, very concerned about this pattern that I'm seeing. And I don't think I'm the only one who's concerned about it, but I find it's such an uncomfortable topic. People don't want to talk about it, but I think that we have to revert back to our old ways if we want to undo a lot of the damages that we're seeing today in the area of our human sexuality. So that's why I wrote the book. I don't want to just point out problems to people. I think that there are tangible solutions for these many, many problems we're seeing.
Well, Pam, you mentioned Weston Price, and we know him and the great work that he did, but there are some, believe it or not, in the world who maybe haven't heard about him. So tell us a little bit about Weston, because as we're saying, we need to get back to traditions and base, truth and diet. People don't really know that we do have a baseline. We do know where true dietary principles reside, and just share with those who may have not heard anything about Weston Price at this point.
Right. Well, Dr. Weston A. Price was actually a Canadian dentist. He set up practice in Cleveland, Ohio, and over 100 years ago or so, he was starting to notice a pattern with his patients. So with the children, he started to see cavities and crooked teeth. Now, he was treating the parents of these children, and in the parents, he didn't really see this pattern. So all of a sudden, in one generation, he started to see this, dental dysfunction, and he started to ask a lot of very important questions. He wanted to know what was causing this problem. So he set out with a camera to travel the world, studying different cultures and comparing their health to their diets. So what he would do is, in primitive cultures, he would analyze the food that they were eating, and in fact, he would send samples of the food to his lab in Cleveland, Ohio, so that he could see what nutrients, the nutrients that we knew of at the time, so he could see what nutrients were actually in the food. And so he, two of the nutrients that he basically focused on at the time were vitamin A and vitamin D, known as the fat-soluble vitamins. And these are nutrients that you would find rich in fatty animal foods. And what happened was, when he would look at these primitive cultures and study their diets, look at their health, he saw radiantly healthy people as long as they maintained a diet that had been used within their culture for generations. Then he would compare these traditional cultures to cultures where Western influence had moved in on their diet. So they would start eating processed foods, for example, or they would start, displacing butter and start using margarine. They would start eating more bread, or they would start eating sugar, or drinking more coffee, or whatever the case may be. They would start using foods to displace their more traditional ancestral foods. And in these cultures where the displacing foods were being introduced, that's when he would start to see problems in terms of the physical health. So he'd start to see cancer, heart disease, diabetes, even infectious diseases. But he didn't see that same issue where people actually had held on to their traditional foods. And when he would study in terms of the fertility issue, Kevin, I'm sure you've heard this, is in cultures like, South America, or in the northern parts of Canada, and with what he would have called the Eskimos at the time, what we call today the Inuit. Some of these cultures actually had what were known as sacred foods, foods that were set aside for parents to help enhance their fertility. So they had nutrient-dense foods that were set aside to really, really help in terms of their ability to reproduce. And in some cases, it would be potentially fish eggs And here in North America, for example, with the natives, when couples were having trouble conceiving a child, they would go on a diet high in bear fat. And then within a matter of a short time, they would conceive a child. So the emphasis is actually on the animal fat, the fat which contains these wonderful fat-soluble vitamins, because they help enhance fertility. And unfortunately, because we have been going towards a low-fat diet here in North America and other countries in the world, we have been seeing all sorts of problems in terms of reduced fertility. And unfortunately, couples are going to fertility clinics and going through all sorts of expensive and uncomfortable treatments. But I never hear of couples being told, well, have you tried increasing your intake of animal fat? That maybe that might help in terms of your ability to reproduce. The couples they're just not being told that. Yet it is in our history, it is in our wisdom that the animal fat helps support fertility.
Yes, and it's interesting. And my pilgrimage through this nutrition journey of life, so to speak, in my business of weight loss and health, as a personal trainer, that's the kind of thing I was up against, was people were overweight and their health was, deteriorating in many, many different ways. And I found that the low-fat diet really was the culprit, because getting the fat out of people's diet really will cause all kinds of catastrophes, ripple effects in many ways. And once we put them on the correct diet, which is high in animal fat, not the correct, but would just say the healthiest diet, which is proven to be the healthiest diet as far as human health is concerned, tremendous benefits begin to happen and very quickly. So, you've taken now this into another direction. So you're not just the general health problems that people are having, but the mental health problems, and now in the reproductive area. This is a gold mine for people who are selling medications and procedures and to keep people sick. One of the keys is to keep them off the fat, the animal fat that can really make them healthy. And I do think my understanding is that infertility clinics today is one of the most profitable and fastest growing markets in the medical arena. It's definitely a boon to their business to keep people in this situation that you're exposing right now.
Yeah, and I just really wish couples could have this information about animal fat and spend a few years at least for both the man and the woman to get healthy first before conceiving the child, because there's another component to this, Kevin, and it ties into the animal fat as well. And because I had debilitating chronic fatigue through my 20s and my 30s, and now that I work with people who have chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, brain fog, depression, anxiety, OCD, insomnia, you name it, I'm working with people who have really debilitating chronic conditions. And what I'm noticing, Kevin, is women in particular who weren't prepared. They were not physically healthy enough to get pregnant in the first place, but miraculously they did get pregnant. And they have a child, beautiful little miracle. But unfortunately, the woman collapses after pregnancy. And she cannot enjoy being a mother. There's no real energy to nurture the child or to basically be involved in a family unit. And this is another yet tragic situation that I'm trying to deal with in my book, is to let people know what a catastrophe this is. It is heartbreaking for me to see that a lot of these women really, are not able to enjoy motherhood to its fullest. And it's not that they're bad mothers. It's not that at all.
I agree. I've experienced this with some people that I've known. And once they had a baby, then they just started having all kinds of health problems. The giving of birth really wreaked havoc on them, and because they weren't eating correctly and then continued down that path, it starts a spiraling effect. And I get that call all the time, two years later or whatever. I was fine until I had my baby, but now I'm overweight, I'm sick, I can't, I'm exhausted. That's a very common issue. And I guess,
and it's leading to a lot of unhappiness, lowered quality of life, and of course it's going to lead to a lot of divorce.
yes.
And it's hard. It shouldn't be happening, and it's not. What happened in my case, of course, I collapsed in my early 20s, and so in my early 20s, of course, wasn't married, didn't have any children. I was so sick that was not even in the cards. If I had had children when I was sick, there's just no way I would have survived. That's how sick I was. But I have so much empathy when I see what's happening to people, because I know that what happened with me was I religiously followed a low-fat diet in the 1970s. As a teenager, I followed a low-fat diet, and I collapsed in the 80s with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And I see this as being the tsunami. This is the trend that occurred in that era, Kevin. If you remember, in the 1970s is when the low-fat diet really reached its hiatus, didn't it? And that's when you start to see this fallout, the psychological problems, the increased rates of chronic fatigue, depression, and so on. And so that was my generation. I was in that first wave of people collapsing with chronic fatigue. That was me in the 80s.
Were you, excuse me, Pam, but you were on following a strict vegetarian diet? Is that what got you into that health catastrophe there?
What happened with me was I was following a diet very low in animal fats in my teens. Doing 500 calorie a day diets that were very popular back then, and unfortunately I still hear about them today. No, what happened with me, and this is a lesson to be learned from everyone, because I have a picture in my book showing my diet growing up as a child. Wow. And I was on a near vegetarian diet, Kevin, my entire life before I collapsed in my early 20s. So from birth, I was on a very low, a diet dangerously low in animal fat. So for breakfast, I would have had, maybe boxed cereal, maybe some skim milk and a glass of orange juice. So hardly any animal fat in my breakfast. For lunch, I would have had maybe a peanut butter and banana sandwich. So hardly any animal fat, if any at all, in my lunch. I might have had some animal fat in my dinner, whatever it was, Kraft dinner or wieners and beans or something like that. But just, I had a terrible diet growing up as a child. And now that I know what I know about diet, I probably only had one real meal a week, and it was roast beef dinner on Sunday night. So I grew up on a near vegetarian diet, and this is an important point because I see this universally, especially here in North America, is that people are essentially following a near vegetarian diet. They're following a diet that's dangerously low in animal fat. And then what happens is they start to feel off. They get sick, like I did. And we start questioning the diet. But we go in the wrong direction. I went in the wrong direction, Kevin. Instead of eating more animal foods in my diet, I unfortunately made the mistake of going in the opposite direction. So I became a vegetarian. In fact, I became a raw food vegan, thinking that was going to turn my health around. Isn't that funny, eh? You have the fork in the road. You have the blue pill or the red pill, and I took the wrong pill. I went the wrong direction, totally diametrically opposed to what I should have chosen to do. So unfortunately, like a lot of vegans, in the beginning, they feel better. And I think that's because essentially they're getting a buzz from all the sugar in their diet, because that's essentially what you're running on is sugar. So I did. I felt better at first, and I thought it was working to help me get better. And unfortunately, after 9 years into the diet, of course, it almost killed me. So I have a lot of warnings to put out to near vegetarians, vegetarians, and vegans, because now I work with all three categories of people, and I see all sorts of terrible health problems with all three categories. My sickest clients being the vegans. Now I'm lucky I've been able to overcome, the malnutrition I went through for whatever length that was, well over 3 decades of my life, essentially, I was malnourished. It takes a lot of work to undo that kind of malnutrition. But what people don't understand, I think, universally, is that the connection between malnutrition and things like fatigue, depression, OCD, insomnia, the more psychological symptoms that people are getting. And look at how we are today, psychologically speaking. I mean, we're just a mess in terms of rates of depression, fatigue, OCD, anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. It's very tragic.
You make a tremendous point, and I think people don't really understand. There's a lot of people out there who are, in all practical purposes, following a vegetarian type diet, even though they wouldn't call themselves vegetarian at all, because what they do eat is they eat skinless, boneless chicken breasts. Mm-hmm. They eat fish with no fat on it. They don't use butter to cook, or they'll put olive oil out. And they're always avoiding animal fat. So even though they're eating so-called animal protein, they're really missing the animal fat. So in a sense, they're and they're not even eating very, very carefully. So they're, for all practical purposes, much of our nation, I believe the United States and Canada, are eating like a vegetarian type diet, because there's very similar health problems are happening to the vegetarian as has happened to the general population.
That's right. That's why I like to use the word near vegetarian, Kevin, because I want to wake people up to understand that the standard American diet is essentially a near vegetarian diet. That's the high carbohydrate, low fat diet. So inadvertently, you're absolutely right, Kevin. People are pretty close to being vegetarian and don't realize it.
And the misinformation is so bad, because here you are already eating a bad diet, and then when your situation got bad, you went somewhere and got some bad information and actually started eating more of a low-fat diet. And that's what many people do. The information flow is still to this day skewed the wrong way, and it's an awful, awful thing.
Yeah, it's tragic, and people are unfortunately, experiencing all sorts of diminished quality of life because of it. I'm working with people who, for example, are too tired. Young men in their 20s who can't get out of bed. They can't even think about going out and finding a girlfriend and getting married and settling down and having children. They are just too exhausted to do it. Or on the other side of the spectrum, I have married couples who are having trouble staying together because they're just too exhausted to be in a relationship. When I work with single people who have fatigue or depression, I tell them, wait until you're feeling better before you go out and find a partner. Because as long as you're sick, it's really, it's almost impossible to be happy in a relationship. And that's another point I raise in my book that is tied to a myth, and the myth being that you have to be happy to be healthy. And quite honestly, Kevin, it's the opposite. I see so much misery around me, and I know it's related to physical health problems. I think you have to be physically healthy in order to be mentally, emotionally healthy. And I think a lot of people think they just have to change how they're thinking, but when you're sick, when you're malnourished, it's really hard to think positive, period.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with that idea. And there are people who are very positive minded, and your attitude can make up a part of that. It is a part of that. But when you're feeling sick and mentally your chemicals in your system aren't working right, and you feel lousy all the time, it's hard to have that positive, happy outlook on life, especially as time goes by and you just, like you said, you don't even feel like getting up, you don't feel like doing anything, and life is wearing them down. It just wears them down, and as you said, even young people in their 20s are suffering this. And what do you think? People are turning to coffee. That seems to be a huge problem, or they'll go to the doctor and get depression medication. Another nightmare scenario that
this is a catastrophe. My last book, Addiction: The Hidden Epidemic, I talk about the bad mood epidemic, and now 25% of our kids today are in trouble mentally. We see over 50% of the population is taking at least 2 prescription medications right now, I think, is the most recent statistic. What I have in this book is I have a chart that outlines the sexual side effects of taking many prescription drugs and even over-the-counter drugs, and other drugs like sugar and caffeine. So what I outline in the book is this notion of chemicals and how they're compromising healthy human sexuality as well. So we've already talked about malnutrition and how that can influence, our fertility, human sexuality as a whole. But we can't ignore the role of the chemicals as well, Kevin. And so absolutely, because of this bad mood epidemic, people are taking more drugs, and I always like to compare what's happening today to what Aldous Huxley foreshadowed in his novel Brave New World, where everybody in that fictitious world was taking a drug called Soma. And I think it's frightening that in 1930 he could foreshadow essentially this drug epidemic that we're looking at today, and how so many people are feeling so lousy that they can't get through the day without a drug, whether it be a street drug, prescription drug, sugar, nicotine, alcohol, whatever the case may be. So we have this drug-induced culture, and what people don't realize is the sexual side effects to using these drugs. And so I have a section in my book outlining the side effects, including things like impotence that are associated with many of the drugs out on the marketplace today. And that's an important thing to point out. I think it's especially where men are concerned, of course, because we see so much erectile dysfunction. And I think if a lot of men knew that potentially some of the drugs that they're taking are actually triggering that symptom, I think that they would think twice before taking some of these prescription drugs.
Yeah, the infertility or the low libido thing, that the situation that's happening today has spurred these new drugs, the vasodilators, I guess they are type of drugs, the Viagra and Cialis, and these. You're right. We're taking drugs that are making us sick, food that is destroying us, and then we need to take other drugs just to have sex, and it's always it's a windfall for the pharmaceutical companies, and destruction for people, and the side effects of those drugs can't be too good either. The libido drugs. You write about that a little bit in your book?
Yeah, that's all in my book. And what I try to point out to people is you have to relax your way to better sex. If you want to get a libido back, it takes a lot of work. There's no doubt about that. But you have to be able to be relaxed in order to enjoy good quality sex. It's not about taking vasodilators. It's you have to be able to relax your nervous system. And what happens when we are so stressed in our fast new world today is you have a teeter-totter, right? If you imagine a teeter-totter. And what happens is as the stress hormones go up, the sex hormones go down.
Wow. As
the stress hormones go up, the sex hormones go down. So say you're overproducing things like adrenaline, then down comes your testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, etc. And unfortunately, people are just running to hormones thinking that's going to solve the problem, but that's going to make matters worse potentially, because you might downregulate your body's ability to produce the hormones, and unfortunately taking hormones you can actually increase your chances of developing cancer. So there is actually a section in my book where I talk about the importance of learning to chillax, learning to slow down so you can try and control the level of adrenaline being pushed out by your adrenal glands. And so I talk about different types of potential breathing exercises that people can do to try and get their systems calmed down, or even meditation if people enjoy that. The trouble I see, Kevin, is that so many people are so wired and tired, that they can't focus long enough to be able to meditate. And if they do meditate, it's a forced act. It's a chore. It's not a pleasure. So the emphasis I have in my book is to find what it is that you need to do to slow down that makes you feel even marginally relaxed, because it's hard when you're pushing out all that adrenaline. It's hard to feel relaxed. So this is going to take a lot of work for people to experiment until they find out what it is that makes them relax.
Prayer is always something I recommend with people. It's not actually meditation, but praying to our God who is in heaven, and I think that
Listen, I have a lot of clients who use prayer, and I have a lot of clients who love reading the Bible.
Yeah.
This is their modality. This is what does relax them.
Right. And I have another, now that you brought up that point about stress, and I believe that the television is one of the worst, mental devices. It really is a promoter of fear and stress constantly. I mean, and so I've, in the last year now I haven't really watched TV at all, and I mentally feel much better, much more relaxed and calm. And I think that between the coffee, the stimulants, as you say, and everything else, and then they sit down at night and they're being bombarded with, shootings and it's just stress.
Well,
so
you're absolutely right.
That's a big part of this, maybe.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword, though, Kevin, because I have clients who can't meditate. They can't read, and that's not because they're illiterate. It's just because their brain is such a fog, right? And so you're not left with a lot of other activities to help them at least, calm down. And so they do use television, and what I ask them to do is try to avoid the things you're talking about. So if they do watch television, I ask them to find something funny, light, a documentary, but to try and avoid, like you say, the negative media. But yeah, for me, when I was really sick, Kevin, television actually saved my life because I really couldn't do much of anything else. I was just a total zombie. But yeah, you've got to stay away from the horrors and the thrillers and the 6 o'clock news. You got to avoid that stuff. Oh yeah, because that will turn your adrenaline on.
Even the weather, they constantly promote the weather as like a catastrophe. Oh, it's a nice day today, but tomorrow it could really be. And just always fear mongering constantly.
They know
the stock
that
market is up today, but tomorrow it could fall. So, you have to, it's a constant drip of stress on people that mentally is doing the same thing that they're using chemicals to do. The food, it's like they're attacking us in various ways, and then over time it just you succumb to it.
Well, fear can be used to keep us in submission and keep us buying things. My first book that I wrote with Dr. Mercola, The Great Bird Flu Hoax, that's a classic example of using fear to sell, right? And that translates to billions of dollars in terms of the money that the vaccine industry can make or the face mask industry can make, and the list goes on and on. But they know that fear sells, and so unfortunately a lot of consumers are oblivious. They don't know that they're being used, that they're being marketed to in a very nefarious way. People have to learn to be more discerning. They have to learn to ask more questions. And the expression, if you want to find out the truth, you follow the money. And that's what I like to do. That's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is researching that kind of money trail, just to see the agendas behind a lot of the messages that we're being bombarded with today in the media. But what bothers me the most is to see innocent people duped. I see people making all sorts of decisions around their health, including the low-fat diet, including vegetarianism, and they think they're making healthy choices, Kevin. And it's tragic to me to see that they don't know. I was one of these people, of course, and I look back and I just kick myself for believing that lie. But I still see it happening, and it's so pervasive today, how popular the low-fat diet still is and how popular vegetarianism still is today. And these are things that are being promoted to make us healthier, and the absolute opposite is true.
Well, it's sort of at the end of the day, there's the idea or the underlying theme that causes children not to be born. Basically, the population is going down. So whether it's through inability to have a baby or desire to even have sexual relationships, and then the destruction of the family because people are sick and they have no strength to do these things, or all of these things work together. Are you seeing that, especially certain foods, like soy, really promote infertility, and
right. Exactly. So we're being overly estrogenized is the issue, and soy is one way that we're being overly exposed to estrogen, and that's yet another thing I even talk about the birth control pill in my book, and one of the original researchers back in the 1970s, Dr. Lionel Tiger. I had the privilege of interviewing him for my book, and in the 1970s. He was testing primates and giving female primates birth control pills. And boy, he sent out a clarion call around the side effects of the birth control pill. Because when he gave the female primates the birth control pill, the males weren't interested in them because they were chemically pregnant. Why would a man be interested in a woman if she's chemically pregnant?
Wow.
Right? So in the 1970s, he divulged this information. And the man is still alive today. And like I said, I have a wonderful interview with him in my book. But, I think a lot of men and women, not just women, but men and women, would be really disturbed to find this information out. How many women have been told that this is a potential side effect? So it's a libido. It can be a libido killer, too, in the long run. Like, it doesn't necessarily happen to everybody who takes the pill, but I still think people need to be, number one, warned about the potential side effects of taking birth control pills, and being offered safer alternatives in terms of the ramifications on one's health.
I was thinking about, there seems to be we hate to use this word conspiracy, but in reality, when you're trying to kill bugs, there's two ways to kill them. You either poison them so that they die, or you use some kind of chemical that disrupts their reproductive system so that eventually they don't reproduce. And that is exactly the formula that people seem to be using on us.
Right, we're overly estrogenized.
Have you ever thought about that?
Yeah. No, well, estrogen, when you overly estrogenize somebody or a society, right, estrogen's going to push down the testosterone, so there's not going to be much of a libido. And on top of that, and this is something that I've learned over the last several years that I wish I had known a long time ago, is all that estrogen is going to make and this is going to sound really strange, it's all very related, so I'm not distracting anybody here, but you have to know that all this estrogen, what it's going to do, not just push down your testosterone, so again that has an implication on your sex drive, but it makes your bile, B-I-L-E, your bile thick, right? And so you cause an imbalance in estrogen and progesterone, your bile starts to get really thick and it starts to form gallstones. And what most people don't know is bile is crucial for your elimination, so it's crucial for forming your stool, for triggering peristalsis. It's one of the main exit routes for excess estrogen. It's one of the main exit routes for metals, unwanted metals in the body.
Wow.
So unfortunately, what happens is becoming overly estrogenized makes your bile really, really thick. So essentially what that means is you become toxic cesspools. And my clients all call themselves, gracefully, they call themselves toxic cesspools. And because we don't have enough symptoms in our bellies, millions and millions of people are out there and they have impaired bile production and bile flow, and they don't know it. And you don't have symptoms, and you can go to the doctor and you can say, how's my bile production today? And they won't know what you're talking about.
Right.
And if you go in and get tested for gallstones, it usually comes back false negative anyway. They can't really see the gallstones.
The estrogen you talk about, it's really feminizing men. And turning men into women and sort of women into something else, but we're not acting normally and fruitfully, as we're designed to do. But we're acting in a way that's just it's almost inhuman. It's a terrible path. It's much worse than we're minimizing it sort of, but it's awful really what we're talking about. What is being done to us in the name of money.
Right, and a lot of the symptoms that we're seeing today, as far-reaching as they are, Kevin. So we see PMS, hot flashes, we see bloating, we see, all sorts of issues related to our hormones and sexuality, and they're being normalized. they're being normalized, and they're not normal. I'm most concerned about young women. I talk to young women, you probably see this a lot, young women who have really disrupted menstrual cycles, all sorts of symptoms within that 28-day period. And these girls think that their symptoms are normal. Their mothers are actually telling them that their symptoms are normal, and the doctors are telling them that their symptoms are normal, and they're not normal. And when women or young girls have dysfunctional cycles, that's a clear red flag that something is going to be wrong down the road in terms of their fertility, in terms of their ability to reproduce. I have yet to talk to a young woman today who has a normal cycle.
Wow.
I have not found one that I have spoken with that has a normal 28-day cycle.
Well, speaking of young women, I want to mention this because you have a chapter, I guess, in your book dedicated to it. It's about over-exercising, and especially I find that young people do this. Young girls especially, and I think it's a terrible thing. I noticed that early on in my career. And speak to us about that a little bit. I think that's a great topic to talk about.
This is something I see, because again, it's that the stress hormone and sex hormone imbalance, right? So when you're over exercising, you're pushing out way too much adrenaline. That competes with your sex hormones. And so over the years, I've spoken with a lot of elite athletes who have overtrained, and they have the fatigue, the brain fog, the insomnia, no sex drive. They're not well. And when I get them to slow down, stop exercising, get them to get themselves healthier, then they have to make the difficult decision as to whether or not they want to go back into their sport. And invariably, they decide that they would rather have their brain working properly than to go back into an aggressive sport again. I'm a recovering over-exerciser as well. I used to spend hours in the gym, and I just cringe now when I think of all the hours I spent overtraining, thinking it was healthy. All those years I should have been doing things like yoga or Tai Chi or, light walking, not power walking,
What were you doing when you were over-exercising? Tell us a little bit about how that routine was for you. What were you...
It's almost embarrassing. I'd get up in the morning and I'd go jogging, then I'd go up to the university and I'd do laps in the pool, and then I would do 2 or 3 aerobics classes,
wow.
Each of them being about an hour long. I would just spend literally hours a day exercising, doing cardio, thinking it was going to give me energy, make me healthy. When I collapsed with the chronic fatigue, I continued on with that kind of routine, thinking it was going to give me energy, but I didn't realize that all that exercise was actually depleting my body's batteries, not recharging them.
Right.
That's a very important message I put out to people right now, because it's just something we take for granted. We think all that exercise is healthy, and it's really not.
I agree, and I'm in the exercise business, so I do encourage exercise, but any one of those things that you did in a day would be fine, not 5 or 6. And the mindset, the problem is, if people would eat properly, in other words, get some animal fat in your diet, eat normally, not snacking all day, but eat meals separated by gaps, these kind of concepts, and then have some moderate exercise in their life that's consistent, you can have excellent health. But what they want to do, or what they think they're doing, is that they're just eating poorly all the time and trying to overcome it with exercise, and you can't, because like you said, the more you're exercising, the more nutrition you're depleting from your body. It's just like a catch-22. So you're working harder and harder, and the harder you run, basically, the more you do, the worse it's getting, and so finally there's a crash and burn.
Yeah, and I'm not anti-exercise at all. I play competitive tennis, actually. I play at the national level. I don't play singles because I don't want to burn out my adrenals again, so I play doubles, but I play a relatively high level of tennis. So, I'm getting my exercise, and, I like doing my stretching, my yoga, I like weightlifting, but you're never going to see me out jogging ever again.
Right. Yeah, I don't want to put down cardio, because cardio is good too. There's a benefit to it, but I do emphasize more weight training and some moderate cardio. As you get older, You know, running can sometimes be very damaging to the body. So it's not that you have to exercise to the point of exhaustion, but you need to have a balance in your life, you know.
Yeah, and if we're talking to somebody today who has chronic fatigue or has depression, I would say that they do need to avoid the cardio, though. If you're healthy, yes, but if you're sick, just chillax, please. Because what I ask my clients to do who have the chronic fatigue and brain fog, depression, etc., is I ask them to visualize that their adrenal glands are in a cast, broken, and I need them to be static in order so that they can heal. Wow. So that's just an aside for people who are struggling with
that's and I haven't heard of that concept before, but that can kind of make sense to me. That sounds like it would be feasible. Would you say that a person with the chronic fatigue still could do some moderate exercise, like some strength training or something like that?
Oh, some light weights, yoga, stretching, maybe some golf, but you know what I mean? Like, they really shouldn't be getting their heart rate up in order so that they can heal their adrenal glands.
I see. Just take it very easy until they
very gentle on their adrenals. Yes, absolutely. If you're listening to this and you're pretty healthy, then you can probably do some cardio. But I just need to say that as an aside for anybody who's dealing with the chronic fatigue and depression and so on. No,
there are definitely some negative side effects to cardiovascular training, and that's just not one that I considered. And that's a pretty good thought. I think I will consider it. I agree. There may be an issue because it's almost like the vegetarian diet and cardio go together. You know, when you think about it.
Well, yeah, I have a whole section in my book about that.
Yeah, and lots of water too. In other words, you always see the people they're eating, you know, fruit and lots of water. You know, not no fat. You know, never an ounce of fat, and they always have a healthy girl on the, you know, in the image, you know, exercising, but in reality they don't show you the person in real life who's being, you know, devastated.
Yeah, and don't be deceived by looks either, because when I had debilitating chronic fatigue, everybody said, "Oh, you look absolutely fine."
That's right.
Like, I'm dying here.
That's right. You look wonderful. Yeah, people sometimes will base their health on thinness. If a person is thin, then they're healthy, and sometimes vegetarians are thin, but they're not healthy at all.
Yeah, and I do talk about having a few curves. If you remember from Dr. Price's research and findings in these primitive cultures, after 40, women typically gained about 15, maybe 20 pounds or so.
Okay.
And that was in preparation for menopause. So ladies, if you have a few curves, please don't panic.
Yes.
It's totally normal to gain weight as you approach menopause. Of course, obesity is not acceptable. Obesity is not healthy. But in my book, I talk about some research that has been published on the BMI, the body mass index, and people who have a BMI of between 25 and 30 actually live longer and are healthier than people with a BMI under 25.
I agree.
Which is going to be rather shocking for some people to hear that.
No, I sometimes will get, you know, I'll get a woman that calls that's over 40, and she really wants to look like she did when she was 20 years old, and that's not really, you know, you just want to look like a healthy 40-year-old person, and that's usually my goal. Of course, I can't dictate to them what they want, you know, but I try to kind of steer them into, look, you know, if you're in a relative good health and your body shape is fine, then, you know, just try to be happy with that, and don't try to look like a 20-year-old girl anymore, because that's just not normal.
Yeah, well, and I see the mood issues when these women are still trying to be skinny at 50. You know, they'd be really difficult to live with. I'm sure they're in a terrible mood most of the time.
Well, you know, it's probably, as you're saying though, that the husbands or the male in their lives maybe is having libido problems because of what's going on with them, and so the woman is thinking, well, it's because I'm not good looking enough, or I'm not thin enough, and then they're working to try to overcome a problem that really isn't even their problem. It's the husband's problem. And
yeah, and it's a lot of it's related to malnutrition, overwork, you know, not balancing, like I say, the difference between the sex hormones and the stress hormones. You know, people have, I have to tell you, Kevin, that one of the most difficult things I have to do with my clients is to get them to slow down.
Right.
To get them to relax. In some cases, it takes me a couple of years to get people to slow down, because in the beginning, it's intangible. It's intangible for people to realize what that really means in this fast new world, because there's so much pressure from family and from society to be busy, to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and go till midnight. But that's not normal, it's not natural, and it's certainly not healthy. So people have to set boundaries. They have to learn how to say no. They can't just volunteer here, volunteer there, and go to this potluck or this church dinner or whatever. You have to learn to say no and slow down and just have a lot of me time today. And you probably know this, Kevin, but when we were primitive men, before agriculture, when we were hunter-gatherers, it's been estimated that we worked about 17 hours a week. We were not hard laborers. That became an issue later on after we invented agriculture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the bondage to slavery, and we're trying to free America from the bondage of health misinformation. And Pam Killeen, thank you for the effort that you have done now for many years, and your new book. It's called Survival of the Unfittest. And your website is pamkilleen.com. Is that right, Pam?
That's right. It's pamkilleen.com, KILLLEN.com. And my book is on Amazon in paperback and ebook version. I'm also on Facebook as well.
All right. And we'll also put some links up on our site, liberationwellness.com, that'll go to Pam. And Pam, I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, as always, to see you and to hear your great story and your great efforts. And we pray that your book would be a blessing to many, many people, and already I'm sure it is going to be, just hearing these encouraging and insightful words from you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Thanks for having me back on your show.
You're welcome. God bless.
You too.
Well, thank you, folks, for joining us today, and Lord willing, we'll see you again on our next Liberation Wellness Hour program. Have a great and healthy day.